The book to which I turn my attention now is a book called Golden Harvest by Jan Tomasz Gross and co-authored. I think she had a lesser role because her name is written here in smaller letters, co-authored with Irina Gross, and the book is published by Oxford University Press, New York, 2012. The subtitle of the book, Events at the Periphery. Events at the periphery of the Holocaust is of considerable significance. This book has some continuity with the book on which I gave my previous talk, The Memory Monster, but this is not a work of fiction. This is a work of historical scholarship. It's a slim book, and it's a book that is written ostensibly around one photograph. It's a photograph that animated the author, a photograph that precipitated, right, the book itself. And I need to say a few things about the author, and then I will turn my attention back to the photograph for a few minutes, and then move on to a brief discussion of some of the principal arguments and elements of this book. Now, Jan Gross is a scholar of the Holocaust, a scholar of considerable reputation, but he's a scholar who has confined his attention, one might say, entirely to the question of the involvement of the Polish people in the Holocaust. His work is considered to be very controversial in Poland, which I believe, I may be mistaken, but I believe that that's his native country. And the book for which he became most well known is a book by the title of Neighbors. The title of that book tells us something about the subject matter of that book and this particular book as well, Golden Harvest, because in Neighbors what he was attempting to understand by excavating the history of one particular set of events, the killing of Jews by their neighbors, by Poles in one small part of Poland. And what he was attempting to understand was how Poles could turn against their neighbors so easily and so quickly. And he was trying to counter the argument that the killings of the Holocaust were always perpetrated by the Germans themselves, by the Nazis. What he's trying to suggest here is that, well, yes, I mean, the groundwork for it may have been laid by the Nazis. It may have been laid also by Stalin and the NKVD, by Stalin's secret police, and by Russians as well. But of course, the groundwork for it, the real groundwork for the killings in such large numbers, and it was in Poland, of course, that the maximum number of people were killed. And I'm leaving aside here people killed on the Russian front, military casualties. Here I'm speaking about civilian casualties and the deliberate extermination and killing of millions of Jews and other civilians during the war. When one keeps this in mind, what is important from the point of view of Gross is that we have to understand the particular ways in which ordinary Poles were turned against Jews and did so not necessarily at the behest of the Germans, but because of long-standing hostility against the Jews. And we know, of course, of the long history of anti-Semitism, not just in Poland, but in large parts of Europe. So this particular book, as I mentioned, is shaped around a particular photograph. It's a photograph. He says he was approached by Oxford University Press to see if he might want to do a book around this one particular photograph. It's a photograph here. I shared this photograph here once again. It's a photograph that shows group of people, something like 20 or 30 people. They're standing there. Some of them are seated, and you see them. You see in front of the seated people, you see some skulls. You have to look carefully at the photograph to see these skulls. And he purports to describe what the real significance of this photograph is. And here I want to recall the title of the book, Events at the Periphery of the Holocaust, right? Because one of the things that he points out, and I think that this is this particular fact is not that well known, although the extrapolations that he makes, I think those extrapolations, that is the deliberate dispossession of the deliberate appropriation, rather, of the property of the Jews by literally millions of people, right? This particular argument, I think, is not unknown, although this book really focuses on that. It does not focus on the killings. To that extent, we might say what it's describing, that is loot, the loot of property, the loot of personal belongings, and the fact that 95% of this was never really returned to the original owners. All of this constitutes something which is at the periphery of the Holocaust, the periphery of the killings. But there are various ways in which we can think about the idea of the periphery. One of the weaknesses of the book, and I would say that this is characteristic of much of Jan Gross's work, is his unwillingness or inability to go beyond this particular set of issues that he's describing and to begin to think about how is it that history is shaped largely around catastrophic events, about catastrophic phenomena shaped around wars and genocides and all of that, right? And what is it that constitutes the periphery of the historian's vision, right? Why is it that everyday incidents of looting, and to some extent some of this can be described as everyday incidents of looting. Of course, this is all concentrated in a short period of time, and it is precipitated by the German takeover, right? Occupation of Poland. But what I'm suggesting here is that this notion of the center and the periphery as a theoretical way to think about what constitutes a historical vision, what falls outside it, what becomes a periphery, right? He doesn't really speculate about any of this in a larger vein outside the provenance of this particular question that he's looking at in relationship to the Holocaust and the role of everyday Polish people. So now let's go back very briefly to the photograph. He points out that this photograph is something that you find very much in what you might describe as harvest iconography. You know, when farmers come together at the end of the harvest, or when they want to display their harvest, so very often they'll stand or be seated together, and then you might see some of the harvest in front of them. What you're seeing here is the skulls that they, so to speak, harvested. And here a metaphor from a book by Zygmunt Bauman, a book called Modernity and the Holocaust, which is one of the most significant books ever really written about the Holocaust and its deeper, meaning and the implications of the Holocaust, and trying to understand it in relationship to the course of Western modernity. So one of the metaphors that Bauman had used in thinking about the Holocaust was the metaphor of the gardener, right? That what he wanted to suggest was that the Shoah, that is the Holocaust, was the gardener's vision of society. That from the point of view of the Nazis and those who assisted them, what they were really doing was they were creating a nice, clean garden. They were cleaning up the weeds, removing the weeds. And very often, in order to remove the weeds, you use insecticide. and pesticide. And what, of course, the Nazis did was they used Zyklon B, right? Lots of people were gassed. There were other ways in which they were killed, but they were gassed as well. And what is not commonly known, although this is not something that he discusses in this book, is that Zyklon B was first really tested as a pesticide, right? So this particular metaphor of the garden is is a metaphor that Gross himself actually, the Shoah as the gardener's vision of society. This is a metaphor that he himself says is quite instructive in helping him to think about some of the issues related to the Holocaust, and this is on pages 40-41 of the book. Now, going back to that photograph yet once again, so what do we see? As I said, we see this harvest iconography. We see a group of people standing there. The whiteness of the women's scarves stands out, and the whiteness of the men's shirts. And at this point, what Gross says is that, that some of the work of Susan Sontag on photography also became useful to him. Sontag had said that a good photograph is, quote, like a quotation or a maxim or a proverb, right? No one in this photograph seems to be smiling. What you see here is the intersection of the living, the people standing there, and the dead, the skulls and the crossbones, right? Neatly piled up in a row in front of them. And this takes him to a whole question of people who were diggers. That's what these people are. So at these camps, when these camps were shut down, right? And some of them were shut down before the end of the war. Some of them, of course, were shut down after the war when they were liberated by Allied troops, generally by Soviet troops, in a few cases American troops as well, right? When these camps were shut down, whatever the period in which they were shut down, diggers would appear. The reason they would appear is because, of course, the story that the Jews had been wealthy, that the Jews had gold that they had hidden, for example, all of these stories cultivated a climate, led to a climate in which the local population was led to believe that if they went to the sites of these camps, right, and if they started digging, that they might actually find gold and other valuables. And he points out, the author of this book points out on page 23, something which is really almost quite shocking, is that some of this digging went on for decades. He even says that some of the skulls were carried home by people who wanted to sort of examine it, in the privacy of your home, because they were worried that if they found some of this gold or other valuables, maybe pearls or other kind of jewelry, right, that if they found it on the field, then others within that community or other diggers would pounce upon them, right? And this is all something that is really rather surprising, right? Now, the larger argument of the book, then, that is extrapolated from this set of circumstances is principally the following. The argument is that once we leave aside the killing, we have to understand that a huge number of people, not just in Poland, but in many other parts of Europe, which came under German occupation, and the vast number of these people that we're speaking about, the vast majority of these people who were dispossessed of their property, these were Jews. And he's saying that there were millions of people who were implicated in dispossessing the Jews of their belongings and their property. And I think it is instructive that when we think about modern debates about the restitution of stolen art, what we're speaking about is valuable art objects that landed up in the major museums of the West. And nearly every week one reads about a certain museum which is now returning, let's say, paintings that were stolen by the Nazis and then ended up in the hands of someone, and then from there eventually they made their way to Museum X, Y, or Z. Right? Now, much of that discussion that we hear today about the restitution of art objects, and we know that this discussion is not confined simply to art objects, art and artifacts looted from Jewish owners. We know, of course, that there is another story we told of monstrous proportions about the theft of art from the colonies by colonial powers, right? And there are literally millions of such objects. But that is, of course, not the provenance of this particular book. That's not the subject of this book, although it is rather curious in some ways that Jan Gross does not attempt to, just very briefly at least, try to link up some of the debates which were already current at the time that he was writing in 2012. I mean, now the debates are more prolific, but certainly at the time that he was writing, at that point already the demand had been made. We know very famously, for example, that the whole demand for the return of the Benin bronzes or the Elgin marbles, taken from the Parthenon in Greece, that these discussions have been really going on for decades, right? Now, and my suggestion here is not, of course, that this is a monumental failing on the part of the author. It's simply that in order to try to make the book accessible in a intellectual way, that is, to make it intellectually interesting to others who are not riveted simply on the story of the Holocaust and what happened to the Jews, sometimes it's useful to think about analogies of the sort that I'm really suggesting. Now, of course, there are a number of things that we have to think about, as he correctly argues, that there was a image that had been circulating very widely for decades, for centuries, really, in much of Europe, and that was the image of the Jew as a bloodsucker, right? And so consequently, many of the people who actually appropriated this property, sometimes they didn't really think that they were engaging in theft as well. And he uses various other phrases. He talks about, for example, the Aryanization of Jewish assets. That some people actually did it with pride, and they thought that, well, this is actually these are possessions that that Jewish people acquired as a consequence of the trade of the Jewish moneylender, and some felt very little, if any, guilt about this. What he describes are many instances where people voluntarily partook of the theft of Jewish property, and they celebrated it, and they exulted in it. And what he says is that effectively the story of the dispossession of dispossessing the Jews of their property, of their belongings, this is the story of the largest transfer of property really in history. A story in which millions of actors and profiteers are involved. He begins the book, incidentally, with a quotation, from Franz Stangl, the first commander of Sobibor, who, when asked after the war why the Jews had been killed, said, "They wanted their money. Have you any idea of the fantastic sums that were involved?" Right? The supposition that they had such huge amounts of property, and this is really and belongings, and this is what really precipitated the whole thing, right? Now, I should also say that, that in some cases, the argument itself is not overstated. What is rather curious is the supposition on the part of the author that there's something rather peculiar about this, that this has not been recognized, because we all know that hundreds of thousands of Germans were involved in the murder of Jews. Hundreds of thousands of Germans, perhaps millions. If millions or hundreds of thousands of Jews or Germans were involved in the murder of Jews, why should it surprise us that millions of people were involved in the theft of Jewish property and belongings? Right? There's no surprise there at all, whatsoever. But the book is written sort of on the supposition that this is something that is really very surprising. And here again you see some of that overlap. You see some of that overlap, right, with the previous book that I talked about, The Memory Monster, because once again what he points out is that, for example, there were so many people who were complicit with this. The Catholic Church was complicit with this whole thing, right? They had no interest in the fate of the Jews, much like Yishai Sarid points out that, well, you know, the Allies knew about the trains that were sending these people, the Jews and others, to Auschwitz, but they never bombed really these railway tracks. And they didn't because, frankly, the fate of the Jews didn't really interest them, right? And he quotes one Polish person who says, we'll have to put up a monument to Hitler for having gotten rid of the Jews. That the Germans did, Hitler did what the Poles wanted to do but dare not do, right? And there are other kinds of overlaps as well, but I'll end over here. Thank you.